started working the night shift at St. Mary's Hospital about 5 years ago. It was an old building, one of those places that had been around for decades, constantly renovated but never quite modernized. There were wings that had been shut down, hallways that led to nowhere, and rooms with peeling wallpaper that reeked of mildew and something else, something metallic. The stories about the hospital started the moment I was hired. The other nurses and techs warned me about the things they had seen and heard: footsteps in empty corridors, patients talking to people who weren't there, call lights from rooms that had been unoccupied for years. I brushed most of it off as superstition. Night shifts can be strange, and exhaustion plays tricks on your mind. But everything changed after one shift. It was a slow night, and I was covering multiple wings by myself while another nurse took her break. The halls were empty, save for the occasional low beep of a heart monitor or the soft murmur of a TV left on in a patient's room. I was sitting at the nurse's station, flipping through some paperwork, when the intercom crackled to life. At first, it was just static. Then I heard it. "Help me." The voice was faint, almost a whisper, but it made the hairs on my arms stand up. I glanced at the phone, confused. There was no caller ID, no indication that the call had come from a patient room. Then, after a pause, another whisper. "Room 409. I frowned. There was no room 409. The hospital only had 3 active floors. Any rooms on the upper floors had been shut down years ago due to budget cuts. I stood up, debating whether to check the security cameras, when I heard something even stranger: the faint sound of a call light beeping. I turned toward the monitor that displayed patient calls. Room 409. My stomach dropped. The number was blinking red, demanding attention. But that was impossible. I had passed that hallway earlier. There was nothing up there but locked doors and abandoned equipment. At that moment, a security guard walked past. I flagged him down, pointing at the screen. "Look at this." He leaned over and frowned. "That's not supposed to be possible. Those floors don't have power." We stared at each other for a few seconds before he finally sighed. "I'll go up with you, just in case." We took the stairs since the elevators didn't run to the upper floors anymore. The air grew colder with every step. By the time we reached the 4th floor landing, I could see my breath in front of me. The hallway was almost pitch black, lit only by a flickering emergency light at the far end. The doors to the old patient rooms were still there, most of them covered in dust and grime. But one door was slightly open. The number on it read 409. The security guard exhaled sharply. "That's not right. These doors should be locked." I reached for my flashlight and stepped forward. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The room was empty, mostly. The bed had been removed long ago, leaving behind deep scratches on the floor where the frame had once been. An old wooden chair sat in the corner, covered in dust except for one thing: the seat. It looked recently disturbed, as if someone had been sitting there. Then we heard it, a soft, wheezing breath. It wasn't coming from the room, it was coming from behind us. We spun around, shining our flashlights down the hallway. At first, there was nothing. But then, the emergency light flickered one more time. And for half a second, we saw it. A woman. Her skin was gray, her hair stringy and unkempt. She stood barefoot in a hospital gown, her arms hanging limply at her sides. Her face was a blur, like static on an old TV. Then the light went out completely. The hallway plunged into darkness. I grabbed the security guard's arm, my pulse hammering in my ears. Neither of us moved, neither of us breathed. Then the sound came again, closer this time, shuffling footsteps, slow and deliberate. The guard reached for his radio, but all that came through was static. Then, directly in front of us, the woman whispered, "You shouldn't be here." We ran. We tore down the stairwell, not stopping until we reached the well-lit 1st floor. The second we burst through the doors, the radio crackled back to life. "All units, report." The security guard was shaking as he pressed the button. "We need someone to check the 4th floor. Now." An hour later, maintenance and a second security team went up. They found nothing. The chair in room 409 was overturned, but there were no footprints, no signs of anyone else being there. That was the last time I ever set foot on that floor. But strange things kept happening. Call lights flickering on in empty rooms, the intercom whispering static at odd hours. Patients waking up in the middle of the night, staring at their doorways, whispering about the woman watching them. One elderly patient grabbed my wrist during a routine checkup a week later. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "She's looking for someone," she whispered. I tried to laugh it off. "Who is?" "The nurse," she said, her pale eyes locking onto mine. "She died in that room, you know." My blood ran cold. Later that night, as I was heading out to my car, I passed by the hospital's old archive room. Curiosity got the best of me, and I searched for anything about room 409. It took me an hour, but I found it. In the 1970s, a nurse had taken her life in that very room after a patient under her care died from a medication error. She had blamed herself, and in her final moments, she had left a note on the chair. "I'm sorry. Please forgive me." I never went back to the 4th floor after that. But sometimes, even now, when I pass by the old stairwell, I swear I hear a chair creak. And just as I turn the corner, I catch a glimpse of something in the reflection of the window. A woman in a faded hospital gown. I've been a night shift nurse for almost 10 years. I've seen it all. Patients swearing they've seen ghosts, sudden deaths in rooms where no one was supposed to die, and things caught on security cameras that no one could explain. But there's one night I'll never forget. It happened at Rosewood Memorial, a hospital built in the 1950s. Over the years, it had been expanded, but certain parts of the building remained untouched. The old psychiatric wing, the original ER, and the abandoned basement level, which had been sealed off decades ago. No one went down there anymore. It was supposed to be empty. That night, I was assigned to the ICU, a quiet ward tucked away on the 4th floor. Most of our patients were critical, hooked up to machines that beeped softly in the background. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the scent of antiseptic filled the air. Around 2:30 a.m., things started getting weird. I was finishing up a chart when I heard the first noise, a soft, distant sound, almost like footsteps. I glanced down the hall, expecting to see a doctor or another nurse making their rounds, but there was no one. I went back to my paperwork, but a few minutes later, I heard it again. This time, it was louder. Not just footsteps, a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled along the floor. I stood up, my heart pounding slightly. The ICU was secure. No patients could leave their rooms on their own, and visitors weren't allowed past 10 p.m. I checked the security feed from the nurses' station. The cameras showed the hallway empty. Then, just as I was about to look away, I saw it. A shadow. It moved across the floor near room 417, stretching unnaturally long under the flickering fluorescent light. I blinked. The shadow was gone. I told myself I was just tired, that the screens had glitched. But as I was about to sit down, one of the patient call lights flickered on. Room 417. My stomach tightened. The patient in 417 was a comatose elderly man. He had been unresponsive for weeks. There was no way he had pressed the call button. Still, I grabbed my chart and walked down the hall, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The door to room 417 was slightly ajar. I knocked lightly before pushing it open. The old man lay in his bed, still as ever, the machines around him beeping steadily. Nothing seemed out of place until I looked at the window. There were streaks on the glass, smudges, like someone had been pressing their hands against it. I shivered. The ICU was on the 4th floor. There was no way anyone could have touched that window from the outside. I walked closer, my breath fogging the glass slightly. The smudges looked almost like handprints. Suddenly, the monitor beside the bed beeped erratically. The old man's heart rate was spiking. His fingers twitched and his eyelids fluttered. Then with a sudden gasping breath, he sat up. I jumped back, nearly dropping my chart. His eyes, pale and unfocused, stared past me, his mouth moving soundlessly. Then, in a voice that wasn't his, he whispered, "He's coming." The monitor flatlined. I scrambled to call for a code blue, but deep down I knew it was pointless. The man was gone. The doctors rushed in, trying to resuscitate him, but I couldn't move. Because just before the doctors arrived, I had seen something in the reflection of the window. A figure. Tall, thin, standing in the corner of the room, watching. By the time I dared to look back, the figure was gone. The death was ruled natural. No one questioned it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in that room with me. The next night, I checked the security footage again. At exactly 2:32 a.m., the camera outside room 417 glitched for 6 seconds, and when it came back, the call light was on. But there was something else. For just a fraction of a second before the static cleared, I saw a face. Not the old man's. Something else. Something grinning. And then the screen went black. After that night, things at the hospital didn't return to normal. Strange occurrences became a regular part of the night shift. Equipment would malfunction in room 417 for no reason. Nurses would hear whispering when no one was there. Patients in nearby rooms would complain about cold spots, saying they felt like someone was watching them. For weeks after his death, staff reported seeing a shadowy figure at the end of the hall, just standing there. Security cameras would pick up movement in the empty room, but whenever someone went to check, it was empty. The most disturbing part? The handprints on the window kept appearing, no matter how many times they were wiped away. Eventually, the hospital sealed off room 417, claiming they needed it for storage. But those of us who worked there knew the truth. Something had been disturbed that night, and even after his death, Daniel Whitaker wasn't done with the hospital. I had been working the night shift at St. Augustine Memorial for about 6 months when it happened. It wasn't a fancy hospital. It was old, and no amount of repainting could hide the decades of wear on its walls. The fluorescent lights in the hallways always flickered, and there was a constant hum in the background from the ventilation system that never quite worked right. Most of the night shift nurses joked about how the place was haunted, but I never paid much attention. I had heard the usual rumors, strange figures appearing in the halls, the sound of whispers in empty rooms, and a patient in room 309 who supposedly saw something the night before he died. But I had never experienced anything myself until that night. It started with something small. I was doing my rounds, walking past the dimly lit rooms, checking in on patients. Most of them were asleep, save for the occasional restless moan or the soft beep of a heart monitor. Then at the very end of the hall, I saw something that made me pause. An elderly woman stood by the window of room 316. Her hospital gown was faded, her white hair long and stringy, and her back was slightly hunched. At first, I thought she was just another patient who had wandered out of bed, which wasn't uncommon in the geriatric wing. I took a step closer. "Ma'am, do you need help?" She didn't move. I stepped into the room, but the second I reached the doorway, I realized something was off. The bed in room 316 was empty. No patient had been assigned to this room. I turned back to the window. She was gone. The air felt heavy, pressing against my chest. I walked over to where she had been standing and looked outside, expecting to see a nurse wheeling her away. The parking lot was empty. I stood there for a long time, trying to rationalize what I had just seen. Maybe I was overworked. Maybe it had just been a trick of the dim lighting. Then, out of the silence, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A whisper. I spun around, scanning the room. There was no one there. The whispering grew louder, like a raspy voice struggling to speak. It was coming from behind me, from the window. I turned back. There, reflected in the glass, was the woman. But she wasn't standing by the window anymore. She was right behind me. Her mouth moved, whispering words I couldn't understand. Her sunken eyes locked onto mine. I felt frozen in place, my breath caught in my throat. Then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. I stumbled out of the room, my heart pounding. My hands were shaking as I returned to the nurse's station. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen. I didn't want to sound crazy. An hour passed. Then the monitors started beeping. Room 314, a patient named Mr. Ellis. His heart rate had suddenly spiked. I rushed inside, expecting to find him in distress, but instead he was sitting up in bed, pale as a ghost. "She was here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Who?" "The old woman." "Who?" he said. "She was standing right by my bed, watching me." I swallowed hard. "What did she say?" His lips trembled. I couldn't understand it. She just kept whispering. He grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "She touched my hand. It was so cold." I tried to reassure him, but the truth was I was just as shaken as he was. I checked his vitals. Everything looked stable, but he wouldn't stop shaking. I stayed with him for a while until he calmed down. But as I turned to leave, he grabbed my wrist again. "She's still here," he whispered. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. The rest of my shift passed in an eerie silence. The next morning, I finally worked up the courage to ask one of the older nurses if she had ever heard of a patient matching the description of the woman I had seen. Her face went pale. "You saw her?" she asked. I nodded. She exhaled slowly and looked around before speaking. "There was an old woman who died here years ago. She was a long-term patient, completely alone. No family, no visitors. She used to wander the halls at night, looking for someone to talk to. One night, she passed away in her sleep. Since then, people have seen her." A lump formed in my throat, and every patient who sees her. The nurse hesitated. "What?" I pressed. "They don't last long." My stomach twisted. I went home that morning, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. But the next night, when I came back from my shift, I learned that Mr. Ellis had passed away in his sleep. I never worked the night shift again. And sometimes even now, when I pass that dark hallway, I swear I feel a pair of cold, sunken eyes watching me.